The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him because he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is coming into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
A little over 2 years ago, the U.S. Bishops' Conference conducted a study that yielded alarming results. Something like 70% of professed Catholics do not believe in the real presence of the Lord in the Eucharist. Many of whom, I might add, in the results of this study, as they were responding to this study, this survey, many of the respondents claimed not even to realize this was the Church's teaching. A rather sad and grim state of affairs. Of course, not long after these results were revealed, we were beset by the pandemic, which generated many intense ecclesiastical concerns as church leaders debated the best ways to continue reverently and safely worshiping God. And many faithful individuals expressed fear to me that the various precautions being taken would only contribute to a further decreased belief in the real presence. And I sympathized with those concerns, although interestingly, I think time and experience have actually revealed the opposite. The debates generated by the pandemic about the manner in which communion is or is not to be distributed foisted upon us a much-needed conversation about the Eucharist and what it is that have resulted in a heightened Eucharistic awareness. Surely an unanticipated and fortuitous catechetical and evangelical blessing. For the next 5 weeks, we divert our attention from the concise and occasionally abrupt reflections of St. Mark's Gospel, which we've been going through in this year of the lectionary cycle. We divert from that for a brief Johannine hiatus. Midway through the summer, the Year B lectionary cycle, recall we have a 3-year Sunday lectionary cycle of readings. The Year B lectionary cycle invites us to spend a few weeks considering the Bread of Life discourse from John chapter 6, from which we've just heard the first few verses. Odd though it may seem to interrupt our Markan pilgrimage, I've always found this Eucharistic diversion occurs at an appropriate and opportune time. I wish us to avail ourselves of the opportunity afforded by the lectionary to spend these weeks reflecting intentionally on the sacrament of the Eucharist, an extraordinary gift that we frequently approach with an unbecoming casualness. Over the course of the next few Sundays, I wish to highlight several Eucharistic features so as to augment and deepen our appreciation for this most splendid of gifts. Now, it's interesting, this morning, this is sort of by way of an aside. This morning, as I was looking at the various breakdown of the John 6 readings that we'll hear the next couple of weeks, I realized that I had not quite planned for something that the liturgical year affords us this time, which is that the Feast of the Assumption falls on a Sunday when we would be talking about the last part of John chapter 6. But while I was originally somewhat distraught by the fact that my planning was going to be thrown off, I realized that celebrating the Feast of the Assumption at the conclusion of a series on the Eucharist is quite appropriate, since after all, the Feast of the Assumption provides us with a glimpse of what a life completely transformed by grace looks like. So we have that to look forward to. The first few verses of John chapter 6 present St. John's account of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, one of the only miracles, apart from the resurrection itself, to be recorded by all four evangelists. And this miracle provides us with an insight into the divine economy that I think is crucial for understanding the Eucharist, an insight that will couch our Eucharistic reflections in the coming weeks. What do I mean by this? Well, you see, given our own finitude, we have a tendency to evaluate all things in terms of scarcity and limitation. That's how humans operate. We think about things in terms of scarcity and limitation. That is, after all, how human economies work. It's Economics 101. And we see this mentality at work in our gospel, both in the question that Jesus puts to the disciples to test them: where can we get food to feed such a number? And we see it in Philip and Andrew's responses to the Lord. 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. And there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many? This statement and question are surely realistic. After all, in the human economy, 2 fish and 5 loaves are simply and quite certainly insufficient for feeding a family, much less several thousand people. However, we run into problems when we try to impose the human economy on the divine economy. The divine economy, the economy of grace, that initiates the work of redemption and sustains and drives and nourishes our transformation in holiness, the work of sanctification, that economy is always an economy of superabundance. This miracle is fittingly placed at the beginning of the Bread of Life discourse because it provides us with a cautionary lesson, a warning, before Jesus' discussion about the bread of life. This miracle provides us with a warning not to apply the principles of human economics to grace. The miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fishes schools us in the economy of grace. It sheds light on how grace works, and it equips us to approach the divine economy, and specifically the sacraments by which God gives us his grace, properly, with boldness, confidence, and gloriously magnificent expectation. Confident that our Lord is never stingy or miserly in distributing grace. Indeed, as the psalmist reminds us in Psalm 48, a psalm I've had stuck in my head the last few days, thy right hand is full of righteousness, O Lord. This truth about the magnanimity of the divine economy is the interpretative key for any consideration of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. Curiously, I think that cultivating an appreciation for the superabundance of the divine economy also shields us from the danger of thinking too narrowly about how God's abundant grace ought to work. I think there's a temptation in the spiritual life to become comfortable with grace working in certain kinds of ways and showing up in specific kinds of places. At church, certainly. In miraculous physical healings, yes. And in converting my obdurate relative or friend. We become convinced that grace simply must work in certain channels to achieve certain effects that we have deemed best. But that, again, is to think in terms of the human economy. That is to constrain grace, to limit its operation. And on the contrary, the superabundance of the divine economy challenges us to be attentive to grace's creativity rather than prescriptive, respectful of the divine initiative and the unexpectedness of God's wisdom. After all, I suspect that none of the disciples anticipated the multiplication of loaves and fishes as a solution to the problem of the hungry multitude. And even more, I suspect none of them had the foggiest inkling that this miracle foreshadowed the far more tremendous miracle by which the Lord would fulfill his promise to be with us until the end of the age. The gift of the Blessed Sacrament by which the Lord makes himself truly present is a creative gift indeed. No other religion claims that God draws and stays that close, abiding with us under the appearance of bread and wine. No other religion claims that that same hidden Lord would not only remain with us, but should quite literally feed us. As we reflect with renewed devotion on the sacrament of the Eucharist in the coming weeks, let's do so with an appreciation for the superabundant creativity of the economy of grace. Because after all, our God is never to be constrained.